Hi, this is Ashish from developerhut.net and welcome to Java Design Pattern series. So, in today's session, we will be going to see the most interesting design pattern, which is Observer Design Pattern. So, in this session, we will be going to cover what is Observer Design Pattern, why we need Observer Design Pattern. We will also going to see one simple use case, which is newspaper agency, and we'll be going to understand how it fits into the Observer Design Pattern. Then we will going to see what are the rules or steps to create the Observer Design Pattern, and then we will implement the Observer Design Pattern with the help of log writer application. So what is Observer Design Pattern? So Observer is an behavioral design pattern and it completely based on publishers and subscriber model. This pattern allows you to define a subscription mechanism which notify to multiple objects about a particular event which other subscriber observing, right? And this particular pattern used when there is one to many relationship. Now let's understand how observer design pattern works. So let's say you are the owner of newspaper agency, right? So newspaper agency gets the newspaper from multiple vendors, right? Each day they will get a bulk of newspaper from multiple vendors, right? And once they get the newspaper, they will start delivering their newspaper to particular reader. Now how reader gets this newspaper, right? So firstly, reader will come to the newspaper agency and they will subscribe to the agency for particular duration of time, let's say monthly subscription or an yearly subscription, right? And once reader subscribed successfully, agency will start delivering the newspaper to particular reader, right? So in this case, multiple readers come to the agency, they will subscribe and agency will start delivering newspaper to them, right? Now let's say at some point of time reader don't want to continue with the newspaper, so user will reader will come to the agency and they will unsubscribe themselves, and from the next day agency will stop delivering the newspaper to that particular reader. So in this case, agency is act as a publisher, right? And reader act as a subscriber. And whenever publisher and subscriber comes together, they forms the observer design pattern. So in Java term, publisher are also referred as the subject and reader or subscriber is referred as an observer. Here agency act as a publisher as it is publishing the newspaper, and reader are or subscriber are act as an observer as they are observing to the particular event, right? Now we will going to see what are the rules or steps to create the observer design pattern. So there are 5 rules or 5 steps we can say. So the first step is of course to create the observer. The next step is to create the subject who will be going to publish the messages. Then once you create the subject, you need to add a provision to add the observer or register or subscribe the observer, right? The next is you need to make a provision to remove, deregister or unsubscribe the observer. And last but not the least, there should be a provision to notify all the observer once particular event is triggered. Okay, so these are the 5 important steps to create the observer design pattern. Now let's go ahead starts creating the observer design pattern. So let's say if I have an application and where users are logging into my application and they are start using the features of the application. Now what I want is I want to catch all the login related activities done by particular users. So what I will do is I want to display all the login activity on a display console, as well as I also want to log their details on a log file. Okay, so in my application there will be a separate module which is login activity, which is monitoring the login and logout events, and once that particular event occur, login activity will log particular messages onto the console as well as a log file. So here basically your login activity is act as a publisher or the subject, and where we are logging the message, which is console or a log file, is act as a subscriber or observer. So let's go ahead and start creating the classes. So firstly we will be going to create the observer. Okay, so I will create one interface. I will say the logger observer, right? Okay, okay, logger observer, right? Let's say click finish. So basically observer is someone who's observing for the messages, and it will log the messages, right? So I will create one method. So public void, I will say log, and I will take a string message. Okay, so I have a logger observer ready. Now next is we will be going to create the subject. So I will say logger, I will say subject, right? Now this logger subject will contain three important things. So first is it contains the add observer, right? So I will say public void add observer. Okay, and it will definitely take the logger observer object, right? So I will say logger and observer, right? So I will say observer. Okay, so you can use any nomenclature for the method. Okay, you can use add observer, or you can use register observer, or you can use the subscribe observer, right? So for simplicity's sake, I am using the simple version. Okay, now next is the remove observer. So public void remove observer, and it will take the logger observer. Okay, so logger observer, I will say observer, right? And third is notify, right? So public void notify, right? Okay, oops, notify observers. Okay, which doesn't take any input, it will just notify all the observers. Okay, so now our skeleton is ready for this. Now let's start creating the implementation classes for both observer as well as the subject. So we're going to log the messages on console as well as on the log file, right? So let's create the first console observer. So I will create a new class. I will say console logger. Okay, now console logger, this console logger implements the your logger observer, right? So I will say logger observer, right? And I will simply override or implement my log method, right? Here we will add our implementation. So I will add the sysout, right? Sysout, and I will simply say message. Okay, so to understand this more clearer way, what I will do, I will add here that I will say it's a console, right? So console, so that I can understand this message is coming from the console logger, right? Now next is we have our console logger ready. Now next is your file logger. So I will go ahead and I will say new class. I will say file logger, right? And you can implement interface from this window also. So you just need to add the interfaces section, click on add. You can add your interface name and you can click on OK, and once you click on finish, Eclipse will do all job for you, right? So it will implement all the methods. So I showed you both the ways how to create the implement the interface. So a normal manual way where you can implement the interface, or you can directly create the interface while creating the class, right? So here I will add my next implementation, and here instead of console I will say file, so that I can understand this log is basically coming from the file logger, right? You can add your own implementation to log into the file, right? So to understand the design pattern, I am just simply putting this is out over here. Okay, now we have the our observers ready. Now let's prepare our subject. So for this I will create the login activity. So I will go ahead, new, and I will say login activity. So login activity, right? Login activity, right? So I will click save. I will say finish. And so before implementing the logger subject, so I will first simply create the basic details of this login activity class. So I will say private. I need a private, I will say string and username. Okay, so all the user which are logging into the application will log into this login activity, and I am storing their username over here. So now whenever there is a login event occur, it will call the login method of the login activity. So I will create the method, and I will simply store the user name in it, right? So I will say public void user logged in, right? So I will say user logged in, and I will say string username, right? And here what I will say, I will username is equal to username, right? So whenever any login event occur, it will just simply call user logged in and pass the username, and we will store this username. Now we will add our implementation. We will add our logger subject. So I will say implements, right? Implements. So we will implement our interface. So I will say implements logger subject, right? And here we will override our method. So you can click on shortcut is Alt Shift S, and you can say override or implement method, and we will implement add observer, notify observers, and remove observer, right? So here before adding the implementation to this method, we need to store these observers somewhere, right, inside this login activity. So for this I need to create the array list. So I will say public okay, I will say private, I will say array list, right? So array list of logger observer, right? So array list of logger observer, and I will say observers, right? And I will initialize this array list, right? So I will say new array list, right? So I have an array list ready, right? And now what I will do, I will simply use this array list and add the element from here. So I will say this dot observer dot add, right? And simply add the observer. Okay, in the same way I will just simply remove the observer in remove observer method. So I will say observer, this dot observer, and I will say remove, right? And I will simply add my observer. So it will remove the observer from the list. And last is notifying all the observer, right? So here what I will do is I will simply iterate here, right? So I will say this dot observer dot not a length, it's a size, right? So here once I get this, I will simply say this dot observers dot get the element at index ith location, and I will just simply extract this to the local variable, right? So local observer, and I will simply call the log method, right? So I will say log, right? And I will pass the user name, right? So username. Okay, so I will also add the message over here. So I will say login activity, right? So login activity, and I will say user logged in, right? So, and this is the message what I want to pass to my logger, right? And so we are ready with our subject also, right? So we have a subject, and we have a two observers, right? So now let's go ahead and create the main method. So I will go here and I will say new class, right? And I will say login main, okay, which contains the main method. So now here first we will create our observer instances. So I will say console logger, right? Console logger, I will say console logger is equal to new console logger, right? And next is the file logger. I will say file logger is equal to new file logger, right? So we have both observers ready. Now let's create the instance of a subject, which is a login activity. So login activity, right? So I will say login activity is equal to new login activity. Now once we have subject ready, our login activity ready, we will just register our observer, right? So login activity dot add our observer, which is console observer, right? And the next is add observer, which is file logger. Now let's say user is going to logged in, so I will simply call the event. I will say user login activity dot user logged in, and here I will say James is going to log in, right? Now we have everything ready. Now let's run this application. I will say run as a Java application, and our okay, so I think I forgot to notify observer method. So once user logged in, we just simply call the notify observer. This is the main thing, because this method will notify all the observers. Okay, now let's go ahead and run as the application as a Java, and here you can see, so on a console we got the message login activity, right? User logged in James, and on file as also we got the same message. Now let's add few more users. So I will simply copy this, and I will say here I will say Harry, and here I will say Tom. Okay, so to make it more funky, what I will do, I will add a thread.sleep after each call. So I will say thread, right? So thread.sleep, and I will add 2 seconds delay, right? And I will simply copy this and add it over here as well, right? Now I need to add the throws declaration, and let's run this. So first James is going to logged in, right? And our both logger should get the James entry, then Harry, and then Tom. Let's run this. So run as Java application, and so first James, then we have Harry, right? And then we have a Tom, right? So let's say now if what I want is don't want to log my messages onto the console, so I will just simply go here and I will say login activity, right, dot remove, right? And I don't want to log it to console logger, right? So now let's go ahead and run the program again. So first we have a console file, again we have console and file, and last we only have a file, right? So this way you can also remove the observer, right? So you can see how flexible this is. So you can add or unsubscribe or remove observer at any point of time, right? And once you deregister it, then your subject will stop sending messages to that particular observer, right? So here's these are the few features of observer design pattern. So as we see, the observer design pattern promotes loose coupling between the all those objects like your subject as well as your observer, right? as both are interacting with each other, but they are very loosely coupled, right? So there is no dependency basically on both of the objects, right? And here, as I mentioned earlier, this allows to send the data to other objects without any change inside the subject or inside the observer classes, right? And as we also see over here, observer can be added or removed at any point of time, right? There are multiple real world cases here. So YouTube is one of the best use case, where you come to particular channel, you will subscribe to that channel, and once you subscribe, YouTube will start sending notifications once any videos gets uploaded on that particular channel, right? Even your Eclipse IDE uses this feature best. I will also show this. Then we created a log writer application, and this is also helpful in monitoring applications, right? Where monitoring application gets the messages from the another application, and they will monitor on basis of their input, right? So if you see the Eclipse, right, here Eclipse has a different editors, right? So we have a package explorer, we have your code editor, you also have a declaration tab, you also have a outline, right? So whenever you change or you select any other file, your declaration and outlines changes automatically, right? So this is basically observer design pattern, right? So it's the use case of observer design pattern, where if you change the subject, so your observer anyway listening to those particular events, and it will start behave differently as per their functionality. So whenever you change from one class to another class, declaration will show their declaration, outline will get all the methods of the class and update the entire tree, right? So this is the best use case of observer design pattern. So in this application, you can also add multiple methods, like you can add the info, you can add error, you can add warn, you can add trace. Like all this method you can add into your observer, and then you can add the implementation according to this inside your subject, and you can expand this application little bit more. So before moving ahead, I request all of you to go ahead and add all these methods and try to implement this observer design pattern, because the design pattern is such a subject which is very easily understandable, but you won't be able to apply the design pattern into your day-to-day activity because you don't have enough of practice, right? So if you want to work on design pattern, if you want to apply the design pattern, do as much as coding you can, right? So first, there are lots of thousands of videos available on internet, thousands of websites which is showing the very simple, which explains the design pattern in very simple way. However, it's very difficult to understand as per my experience. So start coding, go ahead, do this example, and have a fun with it. So I hope you understood the concept of observer design pattern. So if you think this information is valuable, please do like this video, share this video, and subscribe to my